In this clip, we will take a look at the mechanics for building and removing military bridges. A military bridge is a pontoon bridge built during play by an engineering unit. Any engineer unit that remains unused, unmasked, undisrupted, and not in an enemy ZOC during the engineering phase can build a military bridge in any river hex side adjacent to the hex it occupies. So, for example, this Canadian engineer unit here could build a military bridge across this minor river hex site or this minor river hex site during the engineering phase. However, building a military bridge requires an engineer unit to expend a bridging point, which is a special resource supplied to each player by the scenario instructions or as reinforcements. Bridging points are recorded on a player's combat support points tracks found on his tracks card. So, when the scenario instructions indicate that the packed player receives 3 bridging points, he records them on his combat support points tracks, like this. Warsaw Pact combat support points can be expended by any eligible Warsaw Pact unit without regard to nationality. Thus, these 3 Warsaw Pact bridging points could be expended by a Soviet engineer unit, an East German engineer unit, a Czech engineer unit, or a Polish engineer unit. NATO bridging points, on the other hand, are specified by nationality and can be expended only by an eligible unit of the same nationality. So if the scenario instructions specify that the NATO player receives 1 Canadian bridging point and 2 West German bridging points, the NATO player will record them like this. In the example we just looked at, the NATO player would have to expend a Canadian bridge point to build that military bridge over the Fränkische Saale, leaving him with no remaining bridging points. In this next example, the NATO player is again trying to get across the Main River. The West German engineer unit here is not in an enemy ZOC because it occupies a close terrain hex, but it cannot build a military bridge into either of these 2 hexes because they are occupied by an adjacent enemy unit. It could theoretically build a bridge into this hex across this major river hex site. However, the presence of this Soviet unit means that infiltration fire will occur for any friendly unit that attempts to exit this hex, making that a very unattractive bridging site. Accordingly, the NATO player decides that he will build a military bridge to replace this blown civil bridge here. To do this, he must expend a West German bridging point. Note that the blown civil bridge marker remains on the map to indicate that the road into that hex is out. The military bridge marker is placed on top of it to indicate that it is a replacement, but it does not restore the road across the river hex side. Once built, a military bridge is a hex side feature, so the military bridge marker should always be placed with one of its arrows pointing towards the hex side that it crosses. A military bridge negates the river hex side it crosses, so that a unit can cross that hex side, ignoring any normal movement cost or movement prohibition the hex side presents. Instead, it always pays +1 to cross a military bridge hex site. Moreover, a unit can never use road movement to enter hex across a military bridge, even if there is a road printed on the map that crosses the hex site, because by definition the civil bridge will have been blown. Accordingly, any West German unit that enters this hex from the opposite bank is going to have to pay a full movement point for the clear terrain in the hex on the opposite bank, and also a +1 to cross the military bridge hex site for a total of 2 full movement points. A military bridge over a minor river can be left unattended. A military bridge over a major river must be maintained by the engineer unit that built it. The engineer unit is placed under the bridge marker and is considered to occupy the military bridge itself, meaning it's considered to be located in the hex side that the bridge is crossing. While an engineer is maintaining a bridge, a couple of special rules apply to it. The first is that it is considered to have a ZOC only into the two adjacent hexes, the two hexes that are right next to that bridge hex site. The second is that it loses its fire strength. It cannot conduct any fire combat. However, it retains its flak strength, and it can project that flak strength as if it occupied either of the two adjacent hexes. An enemy unit can enter either or both of the hexes adjacent to the military bridge hex site that the engineer is maintaining. The engineer would then, say, be moved to the opposite bank automatically as soon as the enemy unit enters. It is even possible, in theory, for an enemy unit to move from both banks without crossing the actual bridge hex site, in which case the engineer unit itself is placed on top of one of those units, which is an exception to the normal rule that this cannot happen, but the engineer unit continues to exist in the hex site itself until the bridge is actually destroyed. However, no Soviet unit could move across that bridge as long as that engineer unit is maintaining it. The engineer unit itself cannot be attacked, but it is automatically destroyed if the military bridge is destroyed. Any unit from either side can use a military bridge that is not being maintained by an engineer unit, meaning a military bridge over a minor river, since military bridges over minor rivers never need to be maintained. Only the player who owns the maintaining engineer can cross a military bridge over a major river. So in this example, we have a military bridge built over a minor river by this Soviet engineer unit, which has subsequently moved away because it does not need to maintain it. The Warsaw Pact player could cross this bridge, or the NATO player could cross this bridge. That would be perfectly illegal in both cases. If there is no maintaining engineer, a player can destroy a military bridge simply by moving a real friendly unit into one of the two adjacent hexes and having it remain there at the end of the operation. This is not an option available to dummy units. It takes a real unit to shoot up that pontoon bridge. So, for example, this Warsaw Pact unit here is conducting a hasty attack operation to enable it to move next to this Canadian Leopard 1 unit. So it could move 1, 2, without ever naming an objective hex. If it survived defensive fire from this Leopard 1 unit, then at the end of the operation, the Warsaw Pact player would have the option of removing this military bridge marker. It does not matter what operation a unit that undertakes this kind of exercise conducts. So, for instance, if this were a march operation, or even if it was a reserve operation, then given that there are no enemy units that it has to move next to, this unit here could go 1, 1.5, and at the end of this reserve operation, the Warsaw Pact player would again have the option of removing this military bridge marker. Note that this option is available to the friendly player as well. So if this were the activation cycle for the 4 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, this armored unit could move here, end its operation in that hex, or better yet, in that hex, and then this would enable it to remove its own bridge marker. It's remarkably easy to shoot up a pontoon bridge. If there is a maintaining enemy engineer, then friendly units participating in an offensive operation can make either of the hexes adjacent to a military bridge their objective hex, enter that objective hex, and they will automatically destroy the military bridge, plus any maintaining engineer, if at least one of those units survives enemy defensive fire. So in this example, the 45th Guards Tank Regiment is executing a hasty attack operation. The Warsaw Pact player declares that the military bridge is his objective. He moves this first unit up here, and since these are both protected hexes, he can go 1/2, 1.5, 2.5, 3, 4, and 5 into this hex. That forces the engineer unit to automatically pop over to the other side, but this remains the objective hex. This unit here can then go 1, and then the entire stack can go 2, 3, 4, and the whole regiment is now executing this attack. The maintaining engineer unit can never execute defensive fire. It's actually operating the boats that are keeping that bridge intact in the strong current of that major river. However, in this case, any other units that are adjacent to the objective hex can execute defensive fire. So these 2 companies of Leopard 2s would get to execute defensive fire. However, if even a single step of these Soviet tanks survive, then the engineer unit and the military bridge it is maintaining are automatically eliminated. And the military bridge would also then be removed from the hex. Note that a player can never capture an enemy military bridge that is being maintained by an engineer. The most he can accomplish is to shoot up the bridge and destroy it. The final way that a player can destroy an enemy military bridge is by making a fire strike against it. That process would have to start with a successful reconnaissance attempt to locate the military bridge. A player would make a reconnaissance attempt against either of the 2 hexes that are adjacent to that military bridge hex site. He would then refer to the empty hex or military bridge row on the reconnaissance table to find the acquisition value that applies to the range from his spotter. A successful reconnaissance attempt will then acquire the bridge, which will enable the active player to make a fire strike in the ensuing strike segment. This fire strike could be either an army strike or it could be an airstrike. The actual mechanics of making a bridge fire strike are covered in a separate clip because they involve a couple of special features. However, if the fire strike is successful, then the military bridge and any maintaining engineer are eliminated. A friendly engineer unit maintaining a military bridge can walk away at any time. So, whenever it participates in an operation, it can simply move out of that hex and move somewhere else. So in this example, it might cross this bridge, move over to here. At this point, the military bridge that it was maintaining is immediately eliminated at the end of that operation. Alternatively, an engineer can conduct an engineering action during the engineering phase to dismantle the military bridge and recover the engineering point. In this case, during the engineering phase, if it's eligible to conduct an engineering action, the military bridge is simply removed and the engineering point is recovered. The engineer itself can then be placed on either side of the bridge that it has just recovered, so it could remain where it was, or it could move here as part of that engineering action. Similarly, where a military bridge is not being maintained, the player who expended the bridging point to lay that bridge has the option of recovering it by moving an engineer into either of the 2 adjacent hexes, and then that would mean that the unit was used that turn. But on the following turn, during the engineering phase, it can conduct an engineering action to recover that bridging point, and the military bridge marker would be removed, and the bridging point would be recovered. And that ends our clip on military bridges.